It's late. Good. Somewhere in your building, a light is on that shouldn't be. This is Doorlight. Entry 1 is open. Keep your voice down and don't listen alone.
I want to be clear about one thing before I start. I liked him. That matters to me, more now than it did then. I moved into the building on Kessler in March, into 4C, which is a corner unit, and cost me almost nothing, because the radiator knocks, and the windows face a wall. It's an old building, well kept, the kind of place where the floors are original, and so is everything else, and where you learn your neighbors without ever really meeting them. The woman in 2A ran her dishwasher at midnight. Somebody on 3 practiced scales, badly, on Sunday afternoons. That's the whole relationship. You know their schedule, and they know yours, and neither of you ever says so. Walter was 4B, directly across the hall. I met him on the second day, carrying a box up because the elevator was out. He took one end without asking, walked it up 2 flights, set it down inside my door, and didn't come in. I remember that specifically. He stopped at the threshold like there was a line drawn there, and he stayed on his side of it. He was maybe 60, cardigan, glasses on a cord, hair combed the way men that age comb it, like it was a task on a list, polite in a formal way that felt older than he was. And before he left, he said, "Bit of a noisy building. You'll get used to it." Which, sure, old building. That's not a strange thing to say. The first knock came about a week later, 11:40 at night. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, not hard. I opened the door and Walter was standing there in the cardigan with his hands at his sides, and he said, "Sorry to bother you. Did you hear it too?" That's it. That was the whole thing. I said, "Hear what?" And he stood there for a second. And this is the part I keep coming back to. He stood there and something went out of his face. Not fear. Disappointment, like I'd gotten an answer wrong on a test he'd been hoping I'd pass. Then he smiled and said, "Never mind. Old building. Good night." And he went back across the hall and closed his door. He did it again 4 nights later. Same time, near enough. Same 3 knocks. Same question, word for word. "Sorry to bother you. Did you hear it too?" I said no again. He apologized again, went back again, and then it was a thing that happened. Not every night. I want to be accurate. Maybe 2 nights a week, sometimes 3. Always between 11:30 and midnight. Always 3 knocks. Always the same sentence, in the same order, with the same small pause in the middle of it. I want to explain how that stops being strange, because it does. That's the part nobody believes. You'd think a man knocking on your door at midnight, asking about a sound you can't hear, would escalate into something. It didn't. It just became the texture of living there, the same as the radiator, the same as the scales on Sunday. I'd hear the 3 knocks and think, "There's Walter," and I'd get up and open the door and say no, and he'd apologize, and I'd go back to bed. I never once asked him what the sound was. I've thought about why. I think it's because asking would have made it a conversation, and a conversation would have made it real. And some part of me had already decided I didn't want it to be. But things collect. I noticed he never had keys in his hand. Every time, and it was, by then, dozens of times, he'd come from his door to mine, and he'd go back, and his hands were empty and at his sides, which means his door was unlocked, all night, every night. I noticed he never came in, not once. Not when I offered, which I did twice because it was cold in the hall and he was standing in it in a cardigan. He said no thank you both times. Same words, same little step backward. And I noticed, this took months, that the cardigan was always the cardigan. Same one, same small pull in the left cuff, a thread come loose. And it never got worse, and it never got fixed. In August, the super was in the stairwell replacing a light, and I asked him, in the way you ask something you want to sound casual about, how long Walter in 4B had been in the building. And he said, "Who?" I said, "4B, Walter." Older gentleman, glasses on a cord. He thought about it a second and said, "Yeah, Walt, long time, before me," which was a normal answer. That's what I want you to understand. Every single thing anybody said to me about him was a normal answer. I heard it on the 4th of October. I'd been asleep, and I wasn't anymore, and I was lying there in the dark trying to work out what had changed, the way you do, checking the room against the version of it you fell asleep in, and what had changed was that somebody was in my kitchen. Not a noise. That's the thing. I need to be careful here because I've told this part badly before, and people hear noise and they picture footsteps, a cabinet, a chair. It wasn't that. It was the sound a room makes when it's occupied. You know it. You've never once thought about it, but you know it. There's a difference between an empty room and a room with a person standing quietly in it, and you can hear it, and you can't say what it is you're hearing. Air moves differently around a body. Sound comes back to you a little softer. A room with someone in it is closer than a room without. My kitchen was closer. I lay there for, I don't know, a long time, long enough that I stopped being able to tell whether it was still happening or whether I'd just learned the shape of it and couldn't stop hearing it. And then, underneath it, I heard the radiator knock, and it was the ordinary radiator, and the room went back to normal so completely that I almost let myself believe it hadn't. But I didn't, because I had somewhere to put it now. I got up. I put on shoes, which I remember thinking was ridiculous, and I went across the hall in a t-shirt and shoes at 2 a.m. to tell Walter yes. That's what I was feeling. Not fear. Relief. After 7 months, I finally had the right answer, and I couldn't wait until morning to give it to him. I knocked. The door swung. It wasn't locked. Of course it wasn't. It never was, and it came open about a foot, and the hallway light went in ahead of me across a bare floor. There was nothing in it. No furniture, no boxes, no cardigan on a hook. The walls had those pale rectangles where pictures had hung and been taken down, and the tape on the floor from where a rug had been, and a smell I recognized without being able to name until later. It was the smell of a room that's been cleaned professionally and then left alone. I stood in that doorway for a while. The super came up at 8 the next morning because I called him at 7 and wouldn't explain why. He stood in 4B with me, and he was patient about it. And he said, "Walt moved out 3 weeks back, beginning of September." I said that wasn't possible. I said he knocked on my door, and I heard myself about to say last week, and I stopped because I was trying to remember the last time, and I couldn't. I could remember dozens of them. I could not remember the most recent one. The super said the unit had been empty since, said they were painting it Thursday, and then he said the thing I've never been able to put down. He said it kindly. He wasn't being cruel and he wasn't being clever. He was making conversation while he checked the window latch. He said, he was in there a long time on his own, you know. Guy like that. You get to where you'll take any excuse to knock on a door. I went back to my apartment. It was a Tuesday. Ordinary morning. Ordinary light. And I thought about all of it in the wrong order. The way you do. And the thing that finally arrived, the thing that made me sit down on the floor in my own hallway, wasn't that he'd been dead, or gone, or whatever the word is. It was that I'd had it backwards the entire time. He wasn't warning me. He was asking me to say yes. 7 months, twice a week, standing in a cold hallway in a cardigan with the door open behind him. And every single time he asked me one question. And the question was not, did you hear a noise? The question was, am I the only one? And I said no. Over and over and over again, I told a frightened man that he was. I heard my kitchen again last night. I lay there, and I listened to my apartment being closer than it should be.
And I understood that this is what it is now, that it's mine now. And I understood something else, which is that I could not be in that room with it alone. Not again. Not tonight. So I got up, and I went out into the hall, and I stood in front of 4B, which is rented again. A young guy, moved in around Christmas. I've seen him with his bike in the stairwell. And I knocked. Nothing. No light under the door. No sound of anyone getting up. I stood there and I thought, he's asleep. Go back inside. Don't do this. And then I knocked again. That's where this entry closes. A new door opens next week. Until then, leave a light on. And don't listen alone.